Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Conversations Over Coffee with me, Rabbi Steve Wernick. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Helen Fry to the conversation. I look forward to asking her about Thomas Kendrick, the Oskar Schindler of Austria. Before we get to that, we're on Facebook, YouTube, and bestseller.tv. If you like today's conversation, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and share with your friends. Comments are also always appreciated and help us to get the conversation to more people. If you have questions for our guests, please put them in the Facebook or YouTube chat, and we'll do our best to bring them into the show. With that out of the way, allow me to introduce our guest. Dr. Helen Fry has written numerous books on the Second World War, with a specialty in British intelligence, spies, espionage, and prisoners of war, and also the 10,000 German Jewish refugees who fought for Britain. Her latest book, Spymaster, The Man Who Saved MI6, has become a bestseller about the MI6 spy Thomas Kendrick. Her acclaimed book, The Walls Have Ears, The Greatest Intelligence Operation of World War II, was in the Daily Mail's top 8 books of the year on war. Her book, MI9, Escape and Evasion, The Secret Service for Escape and Evasion in World War II, was shortlisted for the Duke of Wellington Medal in Military History in 2021. Helen has appeared in numerous documentaries in the UK as well as in the USA, including David Jason's Service, Spying on Hitler's Army, and Homefront Heroes. She is an ambassador for the Museum of Military Intelligence. Welcome, Helen.
Great to be with you today.
It's wonderful to have you. It's like I'm so into this stuff. It's like talking to you is like being a little boy again, and reading all about the spy stories and Ian Fleming
Yeah.
and so forth. Um, what sparked your interest in this type of history, especially in the history of military intelligence and in spies?
Well, it was all completely accidental because I came across where I live in North London. I came across many, I mean, these are years ago now, many originally German Jewish refugees who fought for Britain. They'd never told their stories. It took years really to gain their trust. And of course, they started off just digging for victory in a Labour unit of the British Army, having been interned for a short time in 1940. And then by the middle of the war, the British government realised we've got the talent of these fluent German speakers, and they start going into intelligence. And one of the veterans that I knew, Fritz Lustig, I'd known him a very long time. He said, "You've been telling all these other stories about us, the refugees, but no one's told our story." I was stuck in the Buckinghamshire countryside, which is just outside London, about 20 miles outside London, with these headsets on, listening to prisoners of war and some of Hitler's generals. Did we do anything that made any difference to the war? And he said, "You'll probably, excuse me a moment, you'll probably never have heard of my commanding officer, Colonel Thomas Kendrick." And I had, because I already knew about his legacy in saving Vienna's Jews. So that was a double reason for writing the book.
And so when did that happen? When did you start meeting these German Jewish refugees and now British citizens?
Over 20 years ago. So I've been conducting this research for over 20 years. It doesn't feel like that. As I said at the beginning, it was all completely accidental. I realized no one was telling their stories. I'd only intended to write one book, and now 20 something years later I'm I'm still writing it. And when you get into those whole secret worlds of the likes of the Bletchley Park and the code breakers, there are parallel stories with the German Jewish secret listeners, it's just compelling. And then
We're going to pause for a moment as we hope that Helen will be able to again. We've been having difficulty with connection, which is why we started a little bit late. While we're waiting, this is a really uh, series of stories. Yuri, why don't you put up again Helen's? Well, why don't you put up Helen's webpage? We'll start with that. If you want to learn more about Dr. Helen Fry, you can go to her webpage. We'll put the URL in the put that up on the screen a little bit. But as you can tell, she's like me. She's like, you know, an excited kid in a candy shop with these stories. Ah, you're back.
I'm back.
Can
I
you hear
got
me
thrown
okay?
out by the spies.
Yeah, right.
Probably.
Although this time I would think that they're probably Russian spies rather than German spies. So we were talking about who these people were. Are you still with us?
Actions.
You're coming in and out, Helen. Are you still with us? Are you back? Oh. We'll try one more time to bring her back into the show. If not, we're probably going to have to postpone this edition for another time so that we can work with Helen on a more stable connection so that we can have the conversation. Oh, there you are.
I'm back.
Okay.
I've been hiding in the shadows.
We'll try one more time. We were talking about who these German Jews, who these refugees were, and what was their job, and what was the impact that they had on the war effort.
So these were German and Austrian Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany, and they were serving in the British Army as in the middle of the wartime as secret listeners. So they were in 3 secret sites in stately homes outside London, and the interrogators working with them gave the prisoners, German prisoners of war, a sort of phony interrogation. The prisoners would go back to their room and start boasting to their mate what they hadn't told the interrogating officer. And of course, what they didn't realize were the microphones were hidden in the light fittings in the fireplaces and wired to the M room, which was a special room where these German Jewish secret listeners were based, and they were recording all the conversations. So we have bugged conversations from the very start of the war in September 1939 all the way to the end of the war, May 45 and beyond. And they picked up incredible amounts of intelligence. I mean, one of the big ones was Hitler's secret weapon program. So the V1s, the V2s, and what I've done in both of those books is to trace those secret listeners have picked up the bug conversations about V1, V2 in 1943, and we bombed Hitler's secret weapon development site, which was on the northern German coast at Peenemünde. Hopefully your listeners will have heard of some of these operations before, but we now understand that that was the final corroborative intelligence that led to the bombing of that site. So what did that mean in reality? It meant that Hitler didn't land those V1s on London for another 9 months. So we rendered those operations non-operational for 9 months. That bought us time, that allowed us to mount the D-Day landings, of course, with the Allied forces. And as I said before, I was just cut out. After Pearl Harbor, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, American intelligence officers are sent over and start working at Kendrick's sites with these secret listeners. So there's a really important legacy there from the Americans as well.
And what did the Americans do with them?
Primarily, they were the interrogators, so working very closely with the secret listeners, handling some of the German generals, accompanying them for what was posh lunches in central London.
Wow.
So one of the ways that we got the prisoners to talk, and particularly Hitler's top generals, and this is what I love about this whole story, we didn't put them in Nissen huts with barbed wire so they would behave like prisoners of war. We held them in a really posh, stately home just at the end of one of the underground lines in North London. It was known as Trent Park. And there we gave them a life of relative luxury. We pampered to their egos. We took them for lunch in central London. We didn't show them the bombed out parts of London. And they didn't question why they were being held in a stately home. But what they didn't know was everywhere was wired for sound. Not just the light fittings and the fireplaces, but the billiards table, the plant pots, all wired down to the M rooms in the basement.
So was there some sort of psychological profile that was done that would show that playing to their ego
Yeah,
that way would do that? Because that's a very different treatment than I understand what the Germans did for the Allied prisoners of war, including the high-ranking officers that they may have captured.
absolutely. I mean, by the end of the war, all those big commanders we captured after D-Day, well, in North Africa to start with, in 42 and 43, they ended up at Trent Park. We pampered to their egos. We understood that in the declassified files in London, in the National Archives, they've profiled each of the generals, and we had a couple of German field marshals as well. All of Hitler's top commanders after capture, and there were over 100 of them, ended up in this one house. Some of the other commanders ended up in America, where again their conversations were bugged. But it was down to the brilliance of the commander Kendrick, who understood German psychology, understood he'd had already, before the war, 30 years of experience working in what today we call MI6 over here. So he understood how best to get the intelligence.
So who was Kendrick? And
Kendrick,
and and I'm a little bit
yeah.
confused. I thought he was MI6's station chief in Vienna. So what was he doing at Trent House?
Yes. So in the period of the 1920s and the 1930s, Kendrick was working for the Secret Intelligence Service, what we call MI6 today, so the James Bond lot. And he was posted there undercover as a British passport control officer. But he didn't do any passport work. He was running spy networks. Some of his spies and agents we know were Jewish families working out of Czechoslovakia, particularly out of Brno. And so he had these huge networks spying first on the Russians in the 1920s and then in the 1930s on both the Russians and the Nazi threat. So that whole destabilizing of democracy. And he was tracking their spies, their agents right across into Hungary, eventually Italy, Nazi Germany. But then when Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, that's when he embarked on this humanitarian mission that went on to save thousands of Austrian Jews. And just to finish the circle on the timeline, ultimately, I mean, the Germans were out for this top spymaster. They didn't know his name. They knew there was someone operational in Vienna. It took a double agent, very dramatic, a double agent to betray him. And he was arrested in the middle of August 1938, had a horrendous time, but then he was finally expelled and thrown back to Britain, to the United Kingdom. And that's when he goes on to set up his World War II bugging operation. So that gives a bit of a sort of timeline.
So just to reiterate this to make sure that I understand it and that our listeners understand it as well. In the 1920s, he was working for MI6 in Vienna.
Yes.
When Vienna was annexed, he was responsible for rescuing thousands of Austrian Jews, and then he
Yes.
was eventually discovered and expelled. And then when he was expelled and went back to the UK, that's when he set up Trent House and this listening operation.
Yes, that's correct.
So what was the way in which he rescued these Jews, and do you have a sense of how big that number actually is?
Yeah, we do, because the files declassified in our National Archives, their Foreign Office files, tell us he saved up to 200 Jews a day.
A day.
An incredible a day.
What did he
Between
do? Just he issued them passports because that was his cover?
that was his cover. He wasn't supposed to be doing
He
passport
wasn't
work.
supposed to be doing that, but he ended up doing that?
He ended up doing that for 15 16 hours a day, long hours, he and his staff. So the British government tightened up on emigration, on allowing refugees into Britain, and they forbade passport officers. Frank Foley was another one. He was working out of Berlin. People will have heard of Frank Foley. Well, Kendrick was Frank Foley's friend and colleague. So there's a mirror there. And the British government forbade 1 month temporary holiday visas. Well, Kendrick completely disobeyed the rules and continued to issued fake visas. So, for example, he got 1,000 teenagers out to what was then Palestine to attend a so-called sporting event. Well, of course, he knew they weren't coming back. That's how he got them out. He helped, we know for sure now, Sigmund Freud and his family. They would never have got out without Kendrick. It still took nearly 2 months to get someone as famous as Freud out of Vienna. And so he saves this whole generation. The other thing he does,
I want to emphasize, Helen, what you're saying here, because I've been reading a book here that's quite famous in Canada, None is Too Many, which is about the way Canada closed its doors to the refugees during the war. What Kendrick and this other gentleman did, his
Foley,
friend
yes,
Foley did, was in violation of British policy. They were breaking the law. They were disobeying the orders of their government, and yet still did what they felt was right. And as a result of that, ensured that thousands of people were able to get away.
Yes, and one of the things he did, anything, he was writing to any country he could in his official position, because nobody knew he was a spymaster officially, and please take, some of these Jews, and some of them have come out of the woodwork now, ended up in Rhodesia. They went to Kenya, and so that parts of what was Rhodesia, and there's a whole generation of people. How's he getting into East Africa? I mean, he was originally born in South Africa, actually British, in 1881, born in South Africa, but he had huge connections also into East Africa. So whoever would take Jewish people, he would use whatever necessary. And the government, he was using secret escape routes through Yugoslavia. And the Foreign Office wrote to him and slapped his wrists and said, you're going to lose your job if you continue doing this. But still, he continued. And one of the things he did, and I don't know that anyone else did this, he would arrange for a car to be driven over the border with a couple of Jewish people in the back, and there would be a notice on the car saying Corps Diplomatique, so diplomatic corps, and if you've got that on the car, you're not allowed to stop it. It's got diplomatic immunity. And they went through the border. He couldn't do that too often, but any way to get Jews out, it's an incredible legacy. And there's one other story I would like to say in this respect, which shows his moral courage. He looks out of the British Passport Office one day in Vienna to see a horrifying scene of a surgeon he recognizes, a Jewish surgeon on his knees scrubbing with the acid solution in the buckets, pregnant woman. He storms out of the office, down the steps, kicks over the bucket solution. It was reported in the newspapers at the time. And he looks at those stormtroopers and he says, "Not on my patch." And they didn't come back. Now, he could have been arrested. And I am really fascinated by, and Varian Fry is another one, American example of spies and diplomats who were prepared to go beyond the call of duty and even risk their lives to save others. It's an incredible legacy for which he's not yet been recognized.
So Fry is fresh in my memory because Dara Horn, in her book People Love Dead Jews, highlights him in the book, but especially also Fry didn't get any recognition or help from the Jewish community or from the American government after the fact. He basically died in obscurity. It seems like with depression and poverty and perhaps even some mental health illness. Why is it we don't know about Kendrick?
Well, he lived for 40 years in the shadow of MI6, working in the shadows. And if we think about it, now, we just assume everybody knows where the famous MI6 building is in London, the famous MI5 building, very recognizable from the Bond films, certainly the MI6 building. But until 2010, MI6 didn't officially exist. Everybody knew. It's a bit like saying, well, the CIA, everybody knows the CIA exists, but they don't admit it. And it was only in 2010, and the official history came out, that they said, guys, we exist. We exist. And of course, well, everybody knew they existed. And so, thinking back, when I started Kendrick's biography, it caused a few, nervous people sort of to ask questions, because they're so top secret that if you start poking around in any of their supposed personnel, they get quite nervous. So you do know,
who's buying the movie rights?
Well, I hope somebody does, because I think he deserves that recognition.
It's
Doesn't he?
an incredible story. It's like, I mean, Oskar Schindler becomes so well known because of Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
And Schindler didn't start with a humanitarian objective. He
No.
wanted to make money. He came to it at some point in time over his development, but that's not how he started. And he saved 1,100 Jews in difficult circumstances. But Fry and Kendrick, as you said, they saved thousands of people. Significantly more than Oskar Schindler did. And they started from the humanitarian perspective, not from some other perspective.
Well, the interesting thing is with Kendrick, you're quite right. And with Kendrick, as with Frank Foley, his colleague in Berlin, and there were others in other passport offices across Germany, they could have chosen a different path. Kendrick, and this is at the time, May 1938. I mean, I know it's from March 38, his rescue efforts, but between May 38 and August 38, Czechoslovakia was really deemed to be the next on the list to be invaded. We know in hindsight it was later, and there was the whole appeasement. So this was a crucial time when Kendrick needed intelligence from his networks. He should have been focusing 100%, that was his job, on networks, but he chose to take the humanitarian route when he didn't have to. And beyond that, he chose to break the rules and also to risk his life. So, yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? I think that's the real important point, that he wasn't just doing his job.
He clearly went far beyond it. What have we not touched upon in this conversation that you think is really essential for people to know about Kendrick and about these secret listeners?
I think it's the intelligence value. So they amass a whole volume, and there are copies of these in the equivalent American archives, whole 75,000 transcripts of their conversations right across the wartime. And it amasses intelligence, which I was told, if we hadn't got this intelligence as late as February 1945, we could have lost the war, because we're into Germany, but Germany could have won the tech war. We are tracking Hitler's atomic bomb program, masses and masses of intelligence our historians need to work through. But I think crucially, we think of the walls have ears, if you like, winning the intelligence war against Nazi Germany, along with the code breakers of Bletchley Park and in Ottawa, etc. But what I discovered in Spymaster, and this is the incredible point too, his life comes full circle, because by 1943, the new threat are the Russians again. They are our allies then. And he starts using those bug conversations to spy, if you like, on the Russians as well as Germans, the Nazi regime. So his unit prepared us for the Cold War in extraordinary ways. So his legacy goes far beyond the Second World War, and we're just beginning to realize that it was immeasurable.
Why is it important to tell these stories today?
because I still believe it is important to learn from history to prevent us, well, hopefully, from making the same mistakes. But I do believe there are lessons to learn. One, there are many parallels over here in the media, and I guess it must be the same in America with what's happening in Ukraine. And if we look back parallels to the 1930s, what can we learn from that? Can we analyze military strategy, other techniques? I mean, I'm not involved, I don't know anything about modern espionage, but I would hope that there would be operations going on, and to look at how things are done in the past
It
and
would
to learn
it would
from
seem
that.
it would seem that we have learned some of those lessons, right? At least judging by the news reports, the U.S. and the CIA's sharing of intelligence prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine seemed to have been spot on.
Yeah,
Seem to have allowed the Ukrainians to prepare themselves perhaps differently to fight the Russians and so forth. What I think is unfortunate is that that intelligence somehow wasn't able to be used to prevent fighting
yes.
from going on and to create some sort of action that perhaps would have stalled Russia from doing that. I was in Poland a couple weeks ago to witness the devastation that's taking place in the refugees and
Mm,
to see the work of
mm,
the Jewish Agency in helping to get Jewish refugees from Ukraine to Poland to um, and then to Israel. And so the suffering is just immense.
mm.
And I that's like I know a lot of people that I talk to. It's like, if we knew all this stuff, how come we couldn't do something preventative? And rather, instead, what we seem to be doing is just reacting. Of course, those reactions seem to be the correct reactions based on the intelligence that was gathered before. So
Mm.
I
It's a
don't know.
complex picture, isn't it?
It is. It always
But you
is.
know, the work that people are doing in Poland to get Ukrainians out, it's just, extraordinary, isn't it? That there are still people, who are prepared to be rescuers. Because we didn't know, did we? In this intervening period where we've had relative peace in Europe, pockets here and there where it hasn't been stable, 20, 30 years ago. But, there humanity, when crunch comes, look at the outpouring of
I,
love and help.
and I think that is when we look at one of the differences between pre-World War II, during the war, immediately after the war, and today, is exactly that, which is the response of Europe and other nations in welcoming the refugees. Um,
Mm,
Poland has absorbed, or or people have passed through Poland, over 2 million people. And you walk
unbelievable,
around the
yeah.
streets of Warsaw, and you hardly see anybody on the road on the street. There are no tents. People are in hotels. They're in centers. They're in people's homes for home hospitality. People are donating Airbnb time
Mm,
to do that. And certainly from a Jewish perspective, having the state of Israel and a functioning global 911
mm,
through the Federation system, the Jewish Agency, um, you if you can get to safety and you qualify for aliyah and the law of return, you can be in Israel 5 or 6 days later. Um, and
amazing,
and
yeah.
and you don't need a Kendrick to be forging documents to get the Jews out of Europe. We
Mm,
actually have a place where they'll go, no questions asked, and no resource unturned in order to get them
mm,
there, and that's a huge difference. Um,
it's
one
marvelous, isn't it? Yeah.
one last question, and that is, what do you believe was the source of Kendrick's humanitarian drive?
That's
Was
a
it just your
question.
upbringing?
That's a question I'm still asking myself, because he did come from a Roman Catholic background, but he wasn't overtly religious. I I don't know. I think maybe it takes a psychiatrist or psychologist to analyze what is it about those spies and diplomats. He had a very strong moral compass, and I can't say whether that came from his childhood or whether there's something that he was prepared to take risks. I mean, at the end of the Boer War in 1901 in South Africa, he's cycling behind enemy lines, gaining intelligence. So he had that kind of flair for danger, which you would see with those spies and espionage, all of that mixed up. So was it reckless? I don't know that he had a reckless personality, because some of my Jewish friends say, well, he must have had a reckless personality. No, he didn't. I'm not sure. There's just something in people, and I'm not sure whether in the crunch moment, who of us would be bystanders and who of us would be rescuers. I really hope, I would have the moral courage to do that. But I don't know if you really know until you're in it. I don't know if
Mm.
that's a satisfactory answer.
It is a satisfactory answer because I think it's an honest answer, and it's one of the questions that we continue to ask ourselves. I certainly hope, like you, that if I were in a circumstance like that, I would have the courage to do
Yeah.
what was right, regardless of the cost. But until
Yeah.
you're in that circumstance, who really knows? Um, Helen, thank you so much. This was a really terrific conversation. I'm glad we got the technology working long enough to keep you on. Thank you for bringing Thomas Kendrick and his incredible contribution to peace and to freedom and to the world, to our attention. And we look forward to hearing about the movie rights being sold. And then maybe we'll have an opportunity to bring you here in person for another conversation about Kendrick, about MI6, and about the importance of intelligence for fighting these important battles that happen in the world.
Thank you for having me. It's been such an honor and privilege to be on your show. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll be back May 9th with a next conversation of Conversations Over Coffee. On May 9th, my guest will be Brandon Ambrosino, and we look for he's a freelance news writer, and we'll be talking about what's happening in the news. You can find out more about Helen Fry on her website, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Conversations Over Coffee. Bye bye, everyone. Thanks.